Welcome to the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center podcast, a show where we connect you with the science and people behind climate adaptation. I'm your host, Michelle Jewell, Communications and Engagement Manager with the Southeast CASC, and I'm joined in the studio today by Maeda! Maeda, welcome! Tell everybody who you are and what's going on.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, I'm Maeda. I'm the ORISE Science Communication and Program Fellow here at CASC, and I'm so excited to be here today for the podcast with Aparna.
I'm thrilled to have you here as well. For the avid listeners, I'm sure there's many of the Southeast Cast podcast. You'll remember that last time Kristen announced her departure. Maeda is our new Kristen. And today we have the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Aparna Bamzai-Dodson. Aparna is the Assistant Regional Administrator of the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, our neighbors to the north. She has studied statistics, mathematics, environmental management, atmospheric sciences, environmental sustainability. The list goes on and on and on. Her work is now on the theory and practice of engaging partners in actionable science for climate adaptation. So Aparna, you really are the quintessential interdisciplinary scientist.
That is a very kind introduction, Michelle. Thank you for that. I have a very diverse background in a lot of different subjects educationally and professionally. I spent time working as a business consultant before coming to the world of research. And so I like to describe myself as a Jill of all trades.
Mhm.
I like to be a boundary spanner and connect people across different disciplinary backgrounds, the research to management gap, and just be that person who pulls everyone together and gets stuff done.
What does that day in the office look like of boundary spanning that you just talked about?
My day-to-day is never the same. I think I actually have one of the coolest jobs in the CASC network as the Assistant Regional Administrator. I get to be plugged into a lot of different efforts, but unlike the regional administrator, I don't have to be the official decision maker. I don't have any fiduciary responsibilities, but I get to talk to partners in the management community about what they care about, what their priorities are. I get to meet with our research scientists, both in academia and within the federal sphere, to find out what expertise they have, what kinds of problems they might be able to help solve and make those connections. So I do a little bit of everything, which for me is really fun.
Yeah. How did you get here? What is your origin story? Looking backwards, what are the dots? How do they connect?
Looking backwards, I did not see how the dots would connect until I got to where I was. I don't think that I made super intentional choices when I started my career. Like most 18-year-olds, I wasn't sure what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I just followed what I was interested in. So that's how I ended up doing statistics and mathematics. And then that's how I ended up as a business consultant. And I found I really enjoyed solving people's problems. So that's when I went back to grad school. I did 3 years in a atmospheric science PhD program and did not complete that degree. And at the time, I felt as if I had made a poor choice in going to graduate school. But without those 3 years of coursework, I wouldn't understand what I do about the global climate system, climate modeling, and climate projections, which is something that I use in my day-to-day. If I hadn't done some of the things that I did, I wouldn't qualify for the position. But I bring all of those other diverse skills to the table when I do the day-to-day work of my job.
I did not know you were a business consultant, and I would love to hear about how that background interacts with your current work, because there's such a divide between the corporate world and the research world.
Yeah, so working in private industry as a consultant, I worked on a long-term contract for the U.S. Postal Service on behalf of the consumer advocate. And so the idea behind our project was to assess whether the Postal Service was delivering on their commitment to consumers. If they say, you pay us and we're going to deliver this in 2 days or 5 days or 7 days, how often do they actually do that? And something that I really enjoyed about that project was that it had a very tangible benefit for the public. We were making sure that the government was providing a service that the public wanted and paid for through taxes and buying postal stamps. The thing that I had a hard time with is that in the private industry consulting world, you're often rolling from one consulting contract to the next. And so your colleagues on any given contract could be your competitors trying to get a spot on the next contract. So while I was really interested in the work that we were doing and the benefits we were giving to the American public, I also felt like it wasn't really a team effort. And one of the things that I really enjoy about being part of the federal government is that I do feel like people join federal service because they want to do the right thing and they want to work together and they want to deliver on their commitment to the American public. I really love the people that I work with, and I love that we are all bought into that mission.
Oh, that's fascinating. I have 2 follow-up questions then. So is that level of service and teamwork what drew you towards your current position? And is that how you ultimately ended up at the North Central CASC?
I'll tackle that in 2 parts. One is what drew me to federal service. That's actually because I am a naturalized U.S. citizen. I moved to this country as a child. I was about 10 years old. And I really appreciate everything that I've been able to gain from being here and being able to participate in this wonderful country that we have. The idea that I could come to this country as an immigrant, become a citizen, and participate in our democratic processes is just a really cool opportunity and something that I really wanted to do. The way that I joined USGS to work for the CASC network was actually I started like you did, Michelle, for a university partner that was funded by the CASC network. I used to work for the University of Oklahoma at the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. Through that, I got to learn more about the federal side of our centers. There's some slight differences between the two halves. The universities tend to do more of the implementation of the climate adaptation work. They are more involved in actually doing some of the research projects and the on-the-ground work with our partners. And the USGS side can be a little bit more high level, thinking about, for example, the investment portfolio of all of our projects. How do we meet broader 5-year goals for our partners? I saw it as an opportunity to both see a bigger picture and help influence how all of that happened. I do miss working on the projects, I will admit. There's a downside to moving up into that more strategic realm. So I try to dabble a little bit and I'll keep a project on the back burner. I couldn't quite let go of it completely.
What is the boundary of North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center? What's your region that you're working in?
The North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center region is essentially that northern Great Plains area, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. And it includes everything from the Rocky Mountains to those Great Plains grasslands and everything in between. We also have states that have a lot of public land and states that are mostly privately owned. So we have a little bit of everything.
So, Aparna, you've navigated the federal USAJobs. You have come out the other end of it successfully with a full-time job. What advice do you have for those early career graduate student, first-time appliers opening up USAJobs for the first time? What would you recommend that they do?
USAJobs is not the easiest platform to navigate, but I do recommend starting your account early, uploading your resume and all of your information and having it ready to go. Make sure that you have at least unofficial copies of your transcripts. To apply to most jobs, you need unofficial copies. For early career scientists, there are opportunities available that are targeted to recent graduates or even to current students. The biggest one is called Pathways, and it is a program that's available across the entire executive branch. Sometimes they are part-time positions for current students, sometimes they are full-time positions for recent grads, but they're typically for short-term, and you have the potential at the end to get converted into a government position. There are other programs, the Presidential Management Fellows Program, that comes with some professional development opportunities. And then there's always other opportunities for working with mentors in the federal government, such as the ORISE program. And we have a lovely example on the podcast today of that. And you don't get employed by the federal government, but you get to learn more about how federal government works.
Yeah, and that's also something that was surprising to me that I did not know when I graduated with my zoology degree 100 years ago, was that there were so many different ways of doing it. And it's easy to feel really discouraged your first few times on USAJobs, but there are other ways of getting into that federal position.
And it can be very discouraging, feel a little bit like throwing something out into the void. But my message to people is to just keep at it, think about it strategically, be early, be proactive, and be persistent.
Yeah, and the tip I'll add to yours, Aparna, is use that CV template that they have. That's what they're looking for.
Everything counts on your federal resume. If you have volunteered, if you have run your church's bake sale, put that on your resume. You want to make sure that you get as much credit for all of your expertise and your experience as you possibly can. You are the expert in your lived experience.
That's profound, Aparna. Profound. Okay, so let's shift gears entirely, Aparna. There's a term we use a lot in the climate adaptation science centers called co-production. Can you give us the 7th grader definition of what co-production means?
I can try. Co-production is the idea that when you're creating some kind of new knowledge, maybe through a scientific project or maybe through some other avenue, you are including people who are involved in the end use of that product or knowledge throughout the entire process of creation. So if it is a research project and you're trying to support how some manager makes a science-informed decision, you include them throughout the research project so they help you define the questions that you're thinking about. They help you think through, how do I best collect the data and analyze it? If you're making selections between different models, you might talk to them to say, okay, well, which model gives the output that fits best into your decision process? The idea is that through co-production, you can create knowledge that is more useful and usable out in the real world.
When I first heard the term co-production, for me, I thought like, yeah, doesn't everybody do that? So talk to me about what are some of the hang-ups or some of the challenges people hit?
The barrier to entry into doing co-production is pretty high. Doing co-production well requires time and resources, and not everybody has that flexibility to devote time in their project towards doing full co-production. Sometimes you have a deadline, and those are very real limitations. Co-production is also not always the most appropriate for a specific context. If you're trying to provide science to support a decision that's highly contentious or maybe politicized, you may not want to do co-production because you may want your results to be unimpeachable. So it might be best to inform people of what you're doing, but not involve them in making decisions about the methods or the project or the data, because you then want to publish those findings and have them stand alone. The other thing is co-production can be intimidating. If you've never done it before and you don't have training in engagement, you don't have training in facilitation, you might be scared that you're going to go into a room, especially if you're working with a community that has traditionally been underserved by the government or by research communities. You may be really scared that you might do something wrong. And we don't have a ton of applications-based practical tools for doing co-production. There are more opportunities to learn those skills than there might have been 10 years ago. And I'm hoping 10 years from now, there will be guidebooks and templates and all kinds of things so that scientists who want to deploy these methods don't have to feel intimidated about how to do it.
So first off, when are you writing that guidebook? Because I would love to have it.
I'm so glad that you asked this question, Michelle, because that's actually one of my side projects. Trying to keep my research interests alive. We have a wonderful ORISE postdoc. Her name's Dr. Megan Moore. So we have a few projects where she's supporting them with their engagement work, thinking about how do you do co-production with managers? How do you bring them in? She's taking all of that information that she's learning through these projects and that's out there in the literature, and she's going to be putting together an engaged research guidebook that steps through everything from the pre-proposal process, writing the proposal, working on the project, dissemination of your results, and at each of those stages through a project, how do you think about those engagement good practices? What are some discrete tools that you can use? We're really, really excited about this, but stay tuned. Hopefully in about a year and a half or 2 years, we will have a finished guidebook that's published and out there with the tools to accompany it.
Yes, I'm excited. We'll have you back in a year and a half, if not before then, to talk about it. Without picking favorites, what's an example of a project that you can say through and through is a great example of how co-production is used?
I'll give an example with some work that we've done with the National Park Service. It's actually taken 10 years and is multiple projects stuck together. And the way we started was the Park Service developed a new kind of plan that they wanted park units to put in place. They're called resource stewardship strategies. And the idea is that these are multi-decadal plans, thinking about how you might want to manage different resources in a park unit. These are long-term plans. They're very comprehensive. We thought this is a perfect opportunity to get parks thinking about climate adaptation. We started with Badlands National Park and Knife River Indian Village, and a case study of doing a resource stewardship strategy for that park, saying, how do you consider climate throughout the entire process of developing that plan? And then we scaled up to other parks, and finally we developed a repeatable process. That got published as supplemental guidance for national park units that want to do climate-smart resource stewardship strategies. Again, very, very heavy input from individual national park units, offices, planners that work with national park units, working across all of these different organizational scales to say what makes sense for planning, what makes sense for the individual unit. What does it look like if it's a quick and dirty planning process? What does it look like if it's a very in-depth planning process? We had to do over 10 of these processes before we developed that generalized guidance. But that's something that, like I said, takes a lot of time and resources to do well.
It seems like those timescales that you mentioned might not always be compatible with the ways that funding works and with the ways that universities work. Can you talk a little bit about navigating co-production within those landscapes?
That's an excellent question, and definitely something that is a challenge. In the past, you could have these projects that were funded at 10 or 15-year timescales. We don't have the ability to do that so much anymore, and so we try to break these into modular processes. So starting with those case studies, doing some pilot work and saying, this is experimental. We are going to see if we can even get this to work once. And once you have a little bit of success, the next phase is going to say, how do we take some best practices or lessons learned or pitfalls that we've identified that we need to avoid and do it better the next time and build on that. And finally, maybe the third project or the fourth project is thinking about something that is scalable and repeatable at a broader organizational scale.
Something that I really liked about the CASCs and your work in particular, Aparna, is that we can measure the success of projects differently than the Western science canons of publications, grant dollars, and, reporting out. What are some of those alternative success measures that you've used in the past?
If you think about the basic goal of the climate adaptation science centers, it is for us to create climate adaptation science that makes fish, wildlife, and their habitats more resilient to climate change. One measure at the very basic nature of that are those fish, wildlife, and their habitats more resilient to climate change. You may be able to measure that on some small scales, but we're not necessarily going to know for sure until decades have passed. So we think about other measures that we might be able to see happening more rapidly. How are people using the information that we produce? Is it showing up directly in a plan or a decision? We can also look at other measures like how do they trust us as people? How do they trust the science we produce? Would they come back? Some of those things are a little bit harder to measure, but those are all indicators of did we do what we said we would do?
I can imagine with your business analysis background, that's something that's much easier for you to wrap your head around and chunk it back and say, okay, well, this is something that lets us know we're getting closer to that goal.
I am a very process-oriented person. So in the projects that I do, I always try to outline the goal up front, just so that everybody is on the same page. We decide them early. We keep revisiting them throughout the lifetime of the project. Sometimes something comes up and you go back to your original goal and you realize we need to change the goal of the project because of this input from our partners. We funded a project that was intended to serve some tribal partners with paleoclimate information about what had happened on their lands in the deep past and where there could have been some potential vegetation transformations, thinking that that might help them as they prepare for the future and prepare for managing the resources on their lands. But as the project spun up, they realized, actually, that's not super helpful to us. And we care about climate projections and doing some scenario planning. So the lead for that project came back to our program and said, our partners have decided that what would be most useful to them is something different. Are you okay with us changing the direction of our project? And we said yes, because we want the science to be useful and usable, and we want to make a difference on the ground. And so they rewrote their plan and they redid their entire set of objectives for that project. So if you look at the original proposal versus what has been produced on that project, they're very, very different. But I would argue in some ways much more successful in meeting that partner need.
To know that your feedback will be listened to, heard, and then taken in is one of those indicators you were talking about of trust, right? To have partners being willing to come to you and be like, listen, we got to change.
And I will commend the scientist who was in charge of that project, because the original proposal was something that was cutting edge science for them. They could have ended up with some really nice journal articles out of it. And so they realized, I'm going to have to make some trade-offs here, but I'm going to have a much better relationship with my partner coming out of this project. And if I want to work with them again in the future, they're going to be bought into the idea that I'm listening to them and I care about what they want.
Yeah. Aparna, thank you so much. You have limited time, and I'm so grateful that you decided to spend some of that time with us today. And then look out for that guidebook coming out sometime soon from Aparna and her team. Aparna, thank you. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real joy to be here. You made it very easy, so thank you so much.
The Southeast CASC podcast is organized by the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center and produced with an immense amount of help by the NC State University Libraries team. The USGS Climate Adaptation Science Center's mission, as Aparna said, is to deliver science that is useful and used to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate.